Okay, hello, tere, Tanssi. I'm Piret Norhani, the Chief Archivist of the Museum of Estonians Abroad, WEMU, and it is really my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's lecture, which will continue the series of events dedicated to the Finno-Ugric peoples and the Indigenous peoples of Canada, which you can see on WEMU YouTube channel. And this lecture would also post it on YouTube if Laara doesn't mind. First, WEMU would like to acknowledge our presence on the land that has been the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by the Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. On behalf of all Estonians in Canada, I'd like to respectfully thank the Indigenous peoples here on whose lands Estonia's pre-World War I immigrants and post-World War II refugees established their new homes. Paradoxically, we as colonized people have found ourselves as colonizers, or should I put it more mildly and say settlers, having subsequently come to these lands of Indigenous peoples. Though often not of our own free will, but forced by the dark events in world history, still, we have come. And it is our own post-colonial past that could help us understand the historical suffering of the Indigenous peoples here and the dilemmas of today, of which, especially over the last summer, we have heard countless tragic stories. Mary Lyons from the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe once said, "When we talk about land, land is part of who we are. It's a mixture of our blood, our past, our current, and our future. We carry our ancestors in us, and they are around us." This is a feeling that Estonians, a small Nordic nation who have lived on the shores of the Baltic Sea for more than 10,000 years, understand very well. So much so that even the oldest known endonym of Estonians is maarahvas, literally meaning land people or country folk. About our speaker. We met with Laara this past summer when I was looking for the speakers for the conference we held in September. And here I have to thank Merli Tamtik, our own Merli, who introduced us. And not just that, Merli and Taavi invited us to a nice dinner at their home. It was a memorable evening for me in many ways, which turned almost into a workshop or a mini seminar on our cultures. Yeah. Laara gave us a sneak peek into the customs and language of her people and was a wonderful storyteller to listen to. Unfortunately, COVID prevented her from attending our conference, but here we are 2 months later to listen to her talk. Dr. Laara Fitznor is a member of the Nisichawaysihk Cree Nation in Manitoba. She pursued her dream of a university education once she learned that with a higher education, she was in a position to embrace ways to challenge and counter acts of oppression while advancing Aboriginal Indigenous knowledge, perspectives, histories, experiences, spiritualities, and realities through her community work and career. She got her education in academic degrees at the University of Toronto and Manitoba, and began her academic career with the University of Manitoba's Access programs in 1982, holding positions as academic counselor and director. From 92 to 98, she joined the Faculty of Education, teaching cross-cultural Aboriginal education. In 98, she joined the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, University of Toronto, to develop a newly established position of Aboriginal education. She returned to the Faculty of Education in Manitoba in 2003 to teach Aboriginal Indigenous education. She assisted professionals, teachers, educators, social workers, police officers to understand the uniqueness of Aboriginal peoples' histories, philosophies, cultures, and contributions to Canadian society. She has served as a member of boards, councils, committees, and working groups where the focus of the work has to advance principles of diversity, equity, and Aboriginal Indigenous leadership rights, knowledges toward culturally relevant growth of Aboriginal people's needs and aspirations. Thanks for joining us tonight, Laara. Aitäh. Hi, screen is yours.
Okay, so can you hear me, Parrot?
Yes, we can hear you.
Share screen. I'm going to share my PowerPoint and I hope it's still on. Oh, I didn't realize it would disappear. Sorry, everyone.
Take your time, no worries.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, there it is.
Yeah.
Okay. Now what I'm seeing is the I gotta figure out how to do this thingy. Okay. Okay, everyone. Greetings, Tere, Sego. So the Estonia Studies Center speaker series for today, November 24th. My topic of my presentation is Indigenous Voices Speaking Back to Colonial Impacts with the Power of Story. And at this point, I am retired senior scholar to Faculty of Education, University of Manitoba. And as you see on my PowerPoint, there's two other photographs besides me in the photo. One is a horsefly, Nisichawaysihk, which is one of my Cree names that was given to me by my grandfather, but I'll say a little bit more about that after. And the other one is one of my spirit names, Wabowden, white turtle woman. And again, that has some cultural significance in terms of my being. Okay, I am trying to get to the next screen, but it's not letting me. Oh, okay, I see this little thingy, sorry. So thanks to my colleague, Marilee Tantic, Department Chair for Educational Administration Foundations and Psychology at the Faculty of Education, University of Manitoba, and her interest in the decolonizing lends to her work on introducing Piret and I, Piret Nuri, who is Norhani, who is a Museum of Estonian Chief Archivist. And thanks to all the folks that are tuning in, all my relations. So I know that the land, territorial, and ancestral acknowledgement was mentioned, but I repeat it again. Nisichawaysihk in Cree, that means long ago, our Indigenous nations acknowledge the lands they visited. I do the same. Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, all newcomers have been invited to this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. So I borrowed this with respect from the Ryerson University site. A teachable note, the land territorial acknowledgement is positioned according to who we are and how we are socially located within our intertwined relationships as Canadians, old and new, and Indigenous bodies. A discussion point amongst Indigenous colleagues usually is reflecting our dialogues of resistance and hopes for mutual reconciliation. I have a declaration here that every Canadian institution ought to have a thoughtful land territorial acknowledgement. Does yours have one? Tansi Netutemak, Tawao Meskanagaski. Tansi, all my relations, welcome to the Estonia Studies Center Speaker Series. Welcome to Turtle Island. Ninaskamaug Seimantu, Apusiskigwan Kawitamatinawao, Nipamatsuanegwa Mitachumuina. I thank Great Spirit that I can share story notes of my life and stories in this title. Indigenous voices speaking back to colonial impacts through the power of story. In doing so, I ask to be guided in a good way with my thoughts and my words and my actions and my spirit. And I'm not sure if you can see me because I'm just looking at my screen here. But I am holding a stone in my hand. I'm not Estonia, but I'm holding a stone in my hand, which is one of our relatives to guide me and keep me grounded as one of our cultural relatives as I speak. Can you see the stone? Is that, can you see me actually? Anybody?
Yes, we can see you. Yeah.
Because all it's reflecting back to me is my own PowerPoint. So I feel like I'm talking to myself, but I know I'm not. So here's the stone. So a little introduction about me, and I know that Pierre also said a lot of my sort of academic career, but it's also important to kind of frame who I am within my cultural being. My Naheo Cree culture is everything that I am that includes my Canadian imprints, that helps me with framing my talk at present. I carry a few names in my life: Laara Fitznor, Wabowden. I am my amazing daughter, Jacqueline Fitznor's mother, raised her as a singer. My languages are Muskego Cree, Cree English, and Winnipeg English, and Wabowden English, some Spanish and Reed English, and of course, Canadian English. I wanted to share a couple of things about my name. The name that was given to me by my grandfather as a toddler is Nisichawaysihk. And you know, to get my attention, that's what they did. But it was based on a little incident when I was a toddler. So it was just customary for our people, our elders, to name us, and that name stayed with us for life. In any case, that name Nisichawaysihk became kind of evident as being important in my life because, like the Nisichawaysihk, I was bugging the institution, bugging our deans, bugging whoever would listen, that we need to have more of an Indigenous presence, Indigenous knowledges and perspectives when we're teaching at the university and when we're doing our work in our academic life. So that was similar to the concept of Nisichawaysihk. Wapasku, White Turtle Woman, is a name that was given to me by some elder friends of mine when I felt ready to receive a spirit name. And I went into a sweat lodge. I gave them tobacco to receive a name. So that was the name. And then the way they framed it was that I was walking like through the pathway of the turtle, because Meskanak also means pathway in our Cree language. And it's also symbolic, meaning turtle. And the turtle carries the path of knowledge. So bringing light into the darkest corners of people's minds. That's where that name comes from. So I have lived with multiple languages throughout my life. And I think many of us who have English as our second language and our Cree or other Indigenous language or any other language. So you know that you're always carrying a number of different languages as we maneuver through life, navigate through life. My cultural upbringing has primarily been Cree upbringing through our language, our foods, our land medicine, harvesting, work, playing with Euro-Canadian schooling experiences, and with the movement to include and lead from Indigenous knowledges and experiences. I recognized when we were young and going to school that we were definitely not going to an Indigenous focused or based school. And our dad was really good at reminding us of that, you know, we're learning the Euro-Canadian way, but that we need to learn to be proud of our heritage and to stand up for that. So that was very much imprinted, as you will see further in the story. So my family and cultural education is I'm biracial, multicultural, Cree-based values and teachings that part of our life got me to be where I am today. Very non-conventional changes. I have one child who's multiracial, reflecting condor and eagle prophecy in that her father's from South America, the Caribbean, and that her grandmother is from the Venezuela First Nations. So in that sense, she carries the condor and the eagle prophecy. So she has a lot of responsibilities related to that. and the career and family, and that we have a lot of prophecies in our family. And one of them being that my grandfather, who was not, did not have English as his language, it's a smattering of words, had some prophecies about me being in big buildings and giving a lot of talks international. So I always found that interesting that he knew that, and then somehow he found a way to support that. Hi, my daughter just walked in, so hi, Jacqueline. And my Canadian education in elementary, high school, university, I purposely say Canadian education because there was not, if there was anything Indigenous, it was in smattering little amounts and one paragraph in a whole book. And so it's something that I had to pursue on my own. I've had an academic career throughout 4 universities and developing a conceptual and theoretical framework that is increasingly Indigenous in thought, perspectives, philosophies, and practices. And this topic, as I said, was Indigenous voices speaking back colonial impact through the power of story. And I want to share with you some guiding principles that enrich me and some selected story notes from my life that spurred me to speak back against colonialism and its impact. This picture here is a very life-affirming picture because it's at home and it has symbols. The way when I was developing this, putting the pictures and sorting it out, it's kind of looked like a spaceship. So I didn't mean it to look like a spaceship, but that's looking across the lake and where I was raised in my home community. And that's what we could see is the expanse, the openness of the universe and the care and the deep spiritual aspect of it. And in the little picture in there is the backdrop is a cloth I got from when I was in Peru working with Indigenous peoples there. And my colleague Margaret will know because she was on one of those trips, which was just an awesome trip. And my feather, which at this point, I looked high and low for it this afternoon, but since I only moved to Toronto, it's probably still packed in some box, so that's why I was able to find my stone. A little bit more about my community. I'm from Manitoba, and my community is called, in Cree is Meskanaganik, was of course turned into Wabowden. And my family, some of my families from Opaskwayak, which is one of the First Nation communities, and Nisichawaysihk, which Barrett also mentioned, Cree Nation. So those are the things that impact, or the peoples that have grown me and impact me. And this is a photo of where I was raised and the land that I've, every summer I go back to that, and it just gives me strength to keep coming back when I come back to urban living. So we may ask, what is speaking back to colonialism? So guided by our history and Indigenous knowledges from time immemorial, it is the relying on guiding values of countering, speaking up and taking a stand, working against the grain, bringing equity into the framework, challenging oppression while asserting, declaring our Indigenous knowledges and lifeways, and much more. And during the course of my little stories, I hope you will know what I mean by that. And your task is to hear in these stories is to understand why we embody strategies of defiance, resistance, advancement, and self-determination. In sharing my story, I am reminded also always that we as Indigenous beings are stories as living expressions of our survivance. I just want to comment on the word survivance. It was kind of coined by of course, the name just escapes me right now, Fitznor, who was an Anishinaabe literary figure, who talks about survivance. It's going beyond surviving, but it's thriving with our Indigenous imprint, our blood memory of what's embodied in our bodies and what we remember that's given to us by our ancestral knowledge that we carry forward. And it's never carried forward in exact same way. It would have been way back in the time, different times, but it's always embodied in the way we could best make sense of the world today. So that's survivance. We never forget, we never give up, we always remember who we are, and that we'll always have memories. When I say that, there's many people that have gone into sweat lodges or into traditional ceremonies, and they've come out transformed, and they can't understand or figure out why they felt that welcome, that connection, that there's a memory there. And that's, just amazing. So I share a quote here by Thomas King that I love this quote because it always about stories. Excuse me for a second. There is a story I know. It's about the earth and how it floats in space on the back of a turtle. I've heard this story many times, and each time somebody tells the story, it changes. Sometimes the change is simply in the voice of the storyteller. Sometimes the change is in the details, sometimes in the order of events. Other times it's the dialogue or the response of the audience. But in all the tellings of all the tellers, the world never leaves the turtle's back, and the turtle never swims away. One time, it was in Prince Rupert, I think, a young girl in the audience asked about the turtle and the earth. If the earth was on the back of a turtle, what was below the turtle? Another turtle, the storyteller told her. And below that turtle, another turtle. And below that, another turtle. The girl begins to laugh, enjoying the game, I imagine. So how many turtles are there, she wanted to know. The storyteller shrugged. No one knows for sure, he told her, but it's turtles all the way down. I once used this quote in a talk I gave at the University of Manitoba in a piece of Morrow Center. And there was some historians there and that were present, settler historians that were there present. And he said to me, he said, Laara, he said, if you and I were to go up into high up into space, and we would look down. And then he said, I would look down, all I would see is land. And I said, well, that's very interesting, because if I would look down, all I would see is a turtle. So I was just thinking, it's what symbolically we can see or hear, and we advance. So he sees land, I see our cultural embodiment of what is there, what we are told. So the truth about stories is that's all we are. That was in a book by Thomas King. As a matter of fact, this book was given to me by one of my friends that's actually on the linking in with us here, Elizabeth. So thank you for passing me that book so many years ago. So what do I bring into this conversation I was thinking today? So I was thinking, well, there are current things that are happening, and there's so much more, but I think I just selected a couple here. So much more that kind of throws itself into our present mind, into our heart, into our face. So part of it is the past, present. What fires me up is present affected by the past. Here was this chief of the Quebecois First Nation in Quebec who made this big poster, Every Child Matters. And at that point, there was 6,509 bodies and unmarked graves recovered. Say, as I'm saying that, I feel the pain in my body, in my heart, but I'm, calling on the ancestral love to keep me going. So in the bottom there, I put 7,000 plus because I've been seeing new numbers that it's over 7,000. This should impact all of us. These are little bodies, little people, little children that never had a chance to go further than what was taken from them, the life that was taken from them. So this is what fires me up to do this kind of work, to talk in the manner that I do talk in terms of speaking back to colonialism. The other, of course, is the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And there's a book report that was that you can download online. It's called Reclaiming Power and Place, that speaks to the history and what's happened to missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I meant to write the numbers here, but there are so many numbers and so many untold numbers. So these are things I think about in terms of, you know, if we're getting rid of people this way, how can we go forward? How can we continue forward in any kind of mutual transformative way? The other one, of course, I didn't put into my PowerPoint is water. It's the importance of water and how our water has shifted so much with capitalism and colonial impacts and industries that are very profit-oriented. And yet you can see what's happening even in the pipelines in BC, and all the water that's almost reclaiming the lands in BC, because those are old waterways and that were there before. So I find that very interesting. So our stories are teachings in our journey of declaring, reclaiming, revitalizing, countering injustices. How do we be in the world understanding how we are socially positioned in life influences what our scholarship is, in what ideas, topics we choose to talk about and theorize about? You know, these are questions, things that we should think about in all the things that we do, not just in scholarship, but our community work, our artwork, our economy, all the different aspects of living. How can we enact our holistic selves, our mind, body, spirit, intellect, sharing stories of spirit, ancestral influence, and dreams? I wrote the word dreams in there because dreams and visions are a very powerful part of my family and things that happen when we dream. My sister and I, we talk a lot about this, where, you know, sometimes things are given to us in a dream of things we need to do, be mindful of. So those are the very culturally embedded ways that our peoples have lived, and that's being reclaimed through the many ceremonies that we go into, because they sure come alive. I'll tell you that. How do we relate within our inner selves, with family, friends, community, our world, through our spiritual, physical, emotional, intellectual selves? How do we work in good ways with generations now and coming? And how do we pass on good knowledge for good living, and how to make changes as necessary? So these, reflecting back to the stories and learning to speak back to the injustices of colonialism is very important for each of us, every one of us, to do. So there's some story notes that I'm sharing here with pictures. So I come from a very strong land-based identity, then and now, across generations. And as I code and shapeshift within and between my multiple worlds, and I purposely, like, I have multiple universes that I live in. Like currently I'm living in Toronto, but I lived in Winnipeg. I'm from Northern Manitoba. You know, a lot of my life has been interacting with the land, language, our peoples, and all the different things that make up who we are. On the left of the photo here is my grandfather, Joseph Tate, and his father, George Tate. And so my grandfather in our language would be my Musum, Nimusum, Joseph Tate, and his father would be my Chapan. And the word Chapan in Cree really means the connector from the past, because the Chapan for grandfather, great-grandfather, sorry, and great-grandchild, it's the same word, whether it's a boy or a girl, or a grandfather or a grandmother. Chapan, it tells us that our beings are linked from the past into the future. And the second one is a picture of my daughter, Jacqueline, with her kukum, harvesting and cleaning. I love this picture because it just shows my mom in that very spiritual mode of communicating to the earth and to the great spirit, the ancestor, offering tobacco and saying prayers. And it's just a beautiful picture. And I've observed her so many times doing that when I've gone out to harvest with her. So I wanted my daughter to have some of those experiences in growing up, since she was growing up in urban settings. I thought, what can I give her that's part of who we are in terms of our land-based identity and the way that we acknowledge our earth, and everything on earth is alive, all of the roots and the plants, so that we interact in that very mutually respectful way. And the other picture where is a picture of my nephew-in-law and my niece. We're harvesting, in our language, we say the root, wigias, or rat root, or another word is called calamus. Apparently that's kind of an international root, but it's been one of our basic roots in terms of our medicine for keeping us well and healthy. And then because it's in the water, we have to literally get into the water. So there's a lot of prayers that happen, and acknowledgement and appreciation of that land. And because it's hard work, we tend to keep it for the winter. And I've certainly brought my dried roots here to Winnipeg. On the left bottom is my mother and her many years of beading and sewing. And she used to tell us a story that she started when she was 10 years old in doing her own beadwork. And she was a very prolific and very clean, neat worker. And she produced so many gauntlets, shoes, muklets, jackets, everything. And that kind of stayed that in our family. The middle picture there with the pail, and actually that's lard in there, but in the bottom, those pieces there are spruce gum, and then there's grounded rat root or wiggies in the back. So my sister Elsie, who's shown in the boat looking away from the photo there, is she does mix medicine for us. We pick, and she puts it into a salve, into medicine that we could use. And then my brother, who's we went hunting or fishing that day with him on the lake. I call him my cultural brother. He passed away about 5 years ago. And he was always involved on the land and doing all the work that we could do to keep up with our physical, mental, spiritual, and heart within the land base. So some of our family ties and reminders of colonial or cultural are responsibilities as backdrop for understanding colonial impacts. Our family has a lot of spirit of self-reliance, knowledge of land living. Our languages are Cree English and Aboriginal English, bridging into, and people wonder, what do we mean by Aboriginal English? A lot of times we insert Aboriginal words into our English language. How we learned to bridge into changing realities where we had to do that without losing our identity. From our bush education to town education, our perseverance, our faith, our Niheo Cree spirituality, and the Anglican imposition. I clearly say Anglican imposition because my maternal grandfather ended up being a lay minister in the Anglican church, but he spoke only Cree and he did it only in Cree. And I used to wonder why he chose that. So I asked my mom this question one day, and she told me, she said, I used to wonder too. And then what he said I thought was very insightful. And he said that, well, you know, that's where I can speak my language in public. Because as you know, with the history with Indigenous peoples in Canada, our languages were taken from us. We were disallowed to speak. We were punished if we spoke. And you can see in residential schools, a lot of the stories where children were punished for speaking our Indigenous languages. The punishment were varied, and some were very cruel. And I'd say all of them were cruel, like, needles stuck through the tongue, through the hands, through their arms, so many different straps, so many different ways of punishing for speaking the language. So my grandfather, who actually did not go to school, he did not go to residential school or any Canadian school, but took up the Cree syllabic Bible, did it for that reason. And because he also was very ceremonial in our Cree traditions. And I remember hearing him silently or quietly, it can't be not silently, but quietly humming and chanting our Indigenous chanting. And I asked my mom about that. She said, yes. Then I realized, well, the reason he had to do that was because it couldn't be publicly acknowledged during his time. So that's why it's an imposition and mediating or coexisting. My parents had 16 children. There was 8 boys and 8 girls. And we learned to cooperate, meditate, contribute, create, innovate, share, work. I just remember we did so much work, physical work as children, and to keep everything going, to keep our self-sufficiency going. So here's a picture of my my mother in the center. I'm just going to check my time here. Oops. I forgot to start myself. Sorry, Kieran. I forgot to start my my time here so I can kind of keep within, but I'm sure you'll let me know if you can let me know I'm getting close to the time. So here's a great impact of colonial Indian Act policy on my maternal family. The center, the woman standing in the center is my mother, and behind her is her father, Nimusum, my grandfather. And to the right of her, depending on how you're looking at it, is my grandmother, my maternal grandmother. And she was full-blood Cree from Nisichawaysihk, Nelson House, Manitoba. And her father was the last hereditary chief. So you see, with the colonial impact of the Indian Act, the imposition of the Indian Act on our hereditary communities, her family would have lost the hereditary lineage and the patterns and the governance imposed by the imposition of the government Indian Act. The tall woman to the left with a little hat on is my aunt, my mom's older sister. And the 2 boys there are boys that my grandfather had adopted, and they were his nephews, because he had all girls in his family. So he brought those into the family and they were raised by. So in the bottom is other pictures of my beautiful grandmother to the left, and of course, my Musum. So Nugum is my grandmother, and Musum. So there's a note here that I got. My mom's family was non-status Indian due to Nimusum, my grandfather Joseph, leaving his home territory before the treaties were signed. And when he married Nugum Adelaide Hardy, who was full-blood Cree and daughter of last hereditary leader from the Nisichawaysihk Cree Nation, she lost her Indian status from marrying a non-status Indian. Isn't that just not nice? You know, it is the colonial impacts of the Indian Act. So I mentioned my grandfather was like a prophet seer, and he saw me, his granddaughter, having images for the future as being an educator. So that's part of our Indigenous gifts and learning from family history and learning how families were, torn apart and impacted by the Indian Act. This next picture, next slide here is my father, Frederick Fitznor. And there was, again, the impact of colonial Indian Act on the paternal family. My father was in World War II. He was born in 1922 to a German immigrant father. And you'll see in the bottom there, I've got Frederick Fitznor, German grandfather, mystery intrigue. He was born in 1893. I apologize, I have not found any pictures of him. And for years, I used to call him this German guy. And then one day I had to challenge myself and chastise myself and saying, you know, that guy is your grandfather, and that's not a very respectful way to talk about him. But in any case, he married my grandmother, Elsie Ross Fitznor, and Elsie's great grandfather was the first installed Indian Act chief in the Wabowden Cree Nation, and he was also lineage to the hereditary chief. So when she was married to my grandfather, because she was a woman, and women lost their status as Indians when they married non-status Indian men. So in 1921, she got married, and from this union, there came 4 children, and they were all considered non-status. So I wanted to talk about maybe a couple of these stories. When my father was a boy going to school, because his parents separated when they were little, it so happened my grandfather was not very nice to my grandmother. He was, abusive, so she left him. But when she left him, she had 4 children to look after. So what happened was the boys were taken to the First Nation, through the reserve system with the grandparents. And the 2 girls she had were taken to 2 relatives. So with the idea that when she got on her feet, and keeping in mind back then, my father was born in 1922, so at least 7 years after, so 1929, there was no supports for women with who had troublesome families and with children. And she legally could not go back to her First Nation community because she was no longer a status Indian, so that she had no rights there. So that's like, what do you do as a young woman? So she, her kids, she tried to get them back. She, of course, with my dad and his brother, they were connected to her, but the other women relatives who lived already in the downtown part of away from the reserve refused to give the 2 girls up. So it was only when they were adults that they were able to reconnect with her. But when my father was going to school in the on the day school, he went through grade 1, okay, he was there. But when he started entering grade 2, whoever was teaching, the teacher was very conscientious about roll call and getting the status numbers of all the kids in her class. So I guess when it came to him, he couldn't produce a status number, of course, because he didn't have one. So he was told, well, you better go get one from your family. You've got to have one. So he went home. So then they told him that he was not status because his father was German and his mother was no longer status, no longer an Indian because of the Indian Act. So he went back to tell her that. Then they said, well, you can't go to school here. So he was turfed out of school. So his parents wanted him to go to school, his grandparents. So they sent him to school, the downtown part off the reserve to down part of the PAW. And when he went there, the first things that the principal and teachers did to him, saying, you're a little Indian boy, you go to school across on the reserve. So he talked about that experience as feeling like he was a misfit. He didn't fit anywhere. He didn't belong. So that was kind of, his what he felt, and that's why he was always fighting for us, fighting for against injustices and that. He joined the army when he was a young man, and he fought in the army in World War II. And then when he came back, if anybody knows the history of veterans, when they came back from World War I and II, the Canadian government had offered them land and jobs and training so they can get economically set and strengthened and contribute back to Canada. But they would not do that to the Aboriginal veterans. So they were discriminated against in that way. So what he wanted to do is farm on the First Nation land. So he would send whatever money he got to his grandfather. And then when he was discharged, then he went onto the reserve to try to farm, but he was not legally allowed because he was not status. So these are all complicated stories of colonial impacts that, that categories that are developed, and then who fits where, and then who gets controlled where, and who gets thrown away, and of course all of the impacts on the being of the person. So early on, he always recognized my kind of scholarly nature, so he always called me his scholar. So in this, and I know that when I kind of get hard on myself when I'm been studying and going through all of that, I used to say, Dad, why did you have to do that? Why did you make me the scholar? The same with my grandfather. I would say that. Why did you have those visions about me? You know, do you know how much the work this is and how hard it is, how traumatic it is? Of course, you know, I did what I did. So he had this strong sense of challenging injustices. So when the veterans, the war veterans challenged the government, there was, I think there was a compensation paid out to veterans. It was like a very, not a big amount, but he had already passed on, so he would not have received that. But our mother was able to receive that. But what did she do as a kind of a sharing person? She distributed the money amongst her children. So that was interesting. So that's one, again, the colonial impact. So I kind of ask, what do you or what do we do? And I posed the following question in chapter 1 of a book I wrote, or a chapter I wrote in 2012. And I think it remains relevant today in 2021. What can scholars, community and educational leaders do in their bodies of work to demonstrate that their commitments as allies, and more so accomplices for equity, engaging Indigenous settler relationships, Indigenous self-determination, sovereignty, very important, and mutually benefiting, coexisting within our institutions as leaders in multiple realities of social identities that reflect our multiple dimensional realities of truth. And there's a forward suggestion here I have to settler Canadians and those coming after. I say, learn to be an ally. You know, don't take our work and say it's yours, but learn to be an ally. Walk with us, beside us, but never ahead of us. If anybody's watching the news and what's happening across the country, you hear that there's a scholar in Saskatchewan who's claiming to be Indigenous, and she was called out. So I won't say anything more than that, other than that things are happening. And it is painful for those of us who worked hard to work within the academy and to show that we've got something to offer. So there was an allied scholar that said, within Euro-Canadian institutions of learning conventional traditional paradigms, differential social locations and the relative positioning of intellectual subjects constrain many of us from being subversive, resistant, and challenging dominant and or stable knowledge. Thus, to speak about Indigenous knowledge and the decolonization of the Western Euro-Canadian academies to take personal and collective risks. And that was said by a colleague of mine, George Sefate, who's an anti-racism scholar and I believe still at OISE at the University of Toronto. Though this quote reflects speaking back, because they suggest that we use Indigenous knowledges as a political process of academic decolonization. And this has been my scholarship journey with instructors of our academy. And the challenging impact of this journey are another story to tell. So see, we talked about maybe going forward. So what sort of the challenging impacts of those stories? So in closing, I have a few more slides, of course, but I want to say, let's be courageous. Let's take our Indigenous movement forward in a good way. So my relations, my relatives, what's next? Hope, hard work, keep challenging oppressions. Look to those who walk and talk against colonial impacts and for mutual reconciliation. Let me share with you what gives me hope. People give me hope. So youth give me hope. And I hope that many of you know about this amazing young woman. She's, I think she's probably 15 or 16 by now, Autumn Peltier. who is a water advocate, and she addressed United Nations. I think that's totally awesome. So please look her up. So people like her give me hope. My daughter gives me hope. My sweet daughter and her doggy, Brooklyn, on the train. And Indigenous women leaders give me hope. I took this picture and looked through it. So I've got a collection, of course, of, but I didn't post it on my PowerPoint. So if you need the references I have, we'll gladly pass them on to you. So this is Mandy Galmarasti, who is the Quebec's Grand Chief. And then the Assembly of First Nation National Chief, Rose Ann Archibald. First time a woman has come to that position. I say, wow, it's amazing. And the other one is the Honorable Mary May Simon. And the other person there is Kasenhanhawi Skydeer at Ganawagi's Grand Chief. So these are women who come into their own to become leaders, to keep moving forward the things that our ancestral survivance is speaking to. So they give me hope. Our young leaders in Manitoba, since I come from Manitoba, they give me hope. And I've admired these young men with the way that they've taken us forward in challenging oppressions, and they stand out there. And this is one of them is Garrison City, who is Cree, from very close to my home community. And he always speaks so respectfully, and he really strongly supports women and children and families. And the other one is Arlen Dumans, who's also Cree from northern Manitoba. And his language, his dialect is a dialect of my maternal grandmother, my maternal Nugum. And it's a beautiful dialect. And the other one, of course, is a strong, longtime friend of my daughter and I, Jerry Daniels, who is Anishinaabe and has done a lot of work in standing up and standing forward and not giving up. So there's also many Indigenous women leaders in education. I started to name them all here, but some of you know them from across the country. And I would invite you to do your own work and check them out. So UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, on Article 13 gives me hope. Article 13 says, Indigenous peoples have the right to revitalize, use, develop, and transmit to future generations their histories, languages, and oral traditions, philosophies, writing systems, and literatures, and to designate and retain their own names for communities, places, and persons. So, Igusani, Itutemak. So I think what is the future? I can't see the top of it, but that's what it says. So Igusani, that means thank you. And also in Estonia, Aitea, okay. Itutemak, Kenaskimitinawau. Thank you, Itutemak. Thank you, all my relations. Now I ask you to do what you will with the stories. You heard them, you dream on them, and work with them into your own working life or not. But as Thomas King said, don't say in the years to come that you would have lived your life differently if only you heard the story. You've heard it now. Kinaskamitanawao, kisay mantua pasiska kiyayamyan. Thank you for listening to a little bit of my story. And keep making good medicine. As my late mother always said, just do it. I like to ask my daughter Jacqueline, what would your grandmother say to a stuck mode? She replies, just do it. So just do it, aho. Gusani. So.
Yeah, thank you. Hi,
Okay.
hi.
Hold on. Let me find you all here for side. When I'm, can you help me here? My daughter's going to help me here.
Yeah, just stop
I
screen share on the top.
Oh, stop sharing. Okay, there we go.
Here we are. So everyone, please.
Okay, so you know what? I'm not sure. Yeah.
So everyone, please turn
Okay, so I guess at this
your
point,
mic on now.
Karina is saying that if there's any questions, comments, and I would like to pass the stone to somebody symbolically if somebody has a question or a comment.
I have my own stone here.
Oh, cool, Kiara.
So because I have a stone and people probably need a second to figure out what the questions might be. Oh, I can see more.
Way to go, Margaret. Thank you, Margaret.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a question. You said you have hope in women.
Okay, sorry, who had the question?
Correct. Me.
Okay. Yes.
The question, you said you have hope, especially in women educators. Why women? What makes women good leaders?
Well, we're naturally leaders because we're the main ones that end up looking after our children and our family and our the men in our lives, to give them guidance, to give them a push to do the right thing. So, and I think that's been in Manitoba in particular, there's a lot of Indigenous women who have gone into education, who have become leaders in that way. And you know, and then now, like recently, we have a lot more women taking up political leadership and winning elections. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So if anybody else, also, I'm inviting you if you want to provide another answer to that. So I should say I'm not the only one here with answers. We've got a lot of amazing people that are tuning in.
Yeah, if anyone wants to comment on this question, you are very welcome to do. But please turn on your mic, and then we can hear you.
And the interesting thing is, we always kid around in my family, say the women rule in my family. You know, we end up taking a lot of responsibility and moving it forward, and then trying to share and trying to bring our men into responsible positions, responsible family, family people and cultural people. But we just don't give up, I think, is what we don't give up. We persevere. That's the word, persevere.
Mm-hmm.
Laara,
yes.
May I make a comment in addition
Yes.
to your comment about the question about women?
Yeah.
All I want to add, I'd like to add, is that traditionally and historically, we were matriarchal before the colonizers arrived on our shores.
Right.
And so, yeah, and I think that's why, one of the reasons why women take lead roles in the communities, right? And I know particularly on the West Coast and the East Coast, they do regard themselves as matriarchal societies. Patriarchy has taken such huge toll on our histories and our knowledge and our lives that matriarchal information has been buried, right?
Right.
And
thank you very so much for that, because in our language is very matriarchal. So, I mean, it's embedded in who we are. When you're saying why, well, it's embedded in who we are, in our traditions and our culture.
But thank you very much, Laara. I really appreciated your talk. It was deep, and as a First Nations person, I can so relate to a lot of the things that you say. Well, all of the things that you say. Just like it, and for me, it's confirming as a First Nation woman to hear you say these things. So I think it's important for us to learn like this again, to keep learning.
Yeah.
Ikosani.
Legacy.
Any questions from the audience? Please speak out. Yeah, Margaret.
I'll just say, oh, thank you so much, Laara. Merci for that, mon professeur. There's a lot of different things that I could ask you, but the one thing I find so interesting is your knowledge of the history of your family and how important that is to current day realities for your family, but also for the actions that you would want others to partake in. And just everything that you've been taught from your ancestors and from your grandfathers and your grandmothers, and how that impacts your own actions today on the land and in the classroom, and also in what you're directing others to do. So can you just maybe elaborate a bit more about how that reality of knowing history and providing it in good story or good medicine can help other people to do some of the things that you're doing?
Yeah, thank you for that, Margaret. I'm going to do, actually, before I answer that question, Margaret, I'm going to do a little pitch here. Margaret is actually co-editor of a book that's coming out on land-based. What's the title of your book, Margaret?
Land is relation.
So I have a chapter coming up in that. And so a lot of it's like, you know, the things that we learn on the land and how we bring it forward. So I co-wrote it with two of my family members, my sister and my niece. So, so when you're saying that, I should tell you that, I should say that for a lot of people to look at family history and to bring those pieces in, sometimes there's a lot of missing pieces, but depending on the circumstances, right? Historical, personal, because so many of people were taken away from their home bases, their families, or they were immersed into one of the cultural ways of the parents and not the other. So it becomes submerged. So I'm saying that in that way because I'm very aware that sometimes it can be a very painful process of uncovering, of reclaiming, of you know, knowing what, you know, like even in my case, I mean, I am of Scottish and German ancestry, but that's all it is. I have no connection to being Scottish, well, maybe a little bit to Scottish, but no connection to being German, and that's only one generation away, or my dad's generation. No connection whatsoever. And that's where the Canadian identity of pushing those of us to be Indigenous and not to be even Canadian. So that's kind of the underlying tone in many ways, is that people are more interested in our Indigenous selves rather than what our combined being. And my dad always said, you know, we have to be proud of who is in our bodies. You know, that he always acknowledged, you know, you have German ancestry and Scottish ancestry, but you need to fight for the Aboriginal, because that's the one that's being dismissed and displaced and pushed aside. You need to fight for that, because then it embodies all of who you are. So I think from that, I say, you know, we need to know who walks in our bodies. So how do we know who walks in our bodies? Like even going further to the next generation of the one child that I have, that she carries multiple races, multiple identities. And I spoke briefly about the concept of the eagle and the condor, that there is a prophecy that's been told by South and North American Indigenous people about the eagle and the condor, that the eagle and the condor will come together at some point to learn from each other and to grow with each other and to recognize all the gifts that we have. So when I was developing, looking at my own history, and I started to think, well, there's a lot of richness there. And then I started to get angry about the colonial impacts, about the way women were treated and relegated, you know, through the Indian Act and the discrimination, the racism within the Indian Act. So we look at, there's so many parts of that that can affect an individual. So I say to people, take it with eyes wide open, heart wide open, and then be careful to protect yourself always from, because we're going to get lots of judgments coming from all over the place. Sometimes they're not, people don't realize they're judging, and that we find those pieces in our history that make us who we are today. You know, because the more I think about, my grandmother was a residential school victim. I want to say a victim. And I didn't know that she had gone to residential. I guessed, but who do I ask? And then, so when my uncle or my aunt was telling me the stories about how her and her sister used to run away as little girls, like 8 and 9 years old, running away from the school. Give me a break here. You know, here's these 2 little children running away, and they would be caught and get their little butts hauled back into the school. So I used to wonder why she had this hatred and anger towards white people when she married a German white man, and then her second husband was a Scottish white man. And I asked her one day, you know, and then, and her reply was, well, they were my husbands. That was her reply. And then she told me how when she moved off the reserve from, you know, being ousted by the Indian Act, not ousted by her people, make it clear, by the Indian Act, to live in the white settlement community, that when she went out to do her work, her, you know, do laundry, whatever she was doing outside, her white women neighbors would throw tin cans at her and rocks at her and hurl insults at her and slurs at her, and she would run back inside. So imagine this young woman with these little children that were, you know, mixed children. So, so those are her memories, her experiences of coming into trying to find out who she was, and then the confusion of not being able to, I'm sure that she had a lot of confusion of not being able to go live back on the reserve. And this is one of the reasons why, you see, these are side stories that happen when you ask me a question, you know, other things come into play. In Nepal, where my grand people are from, by my paternal side, there's the First Nation Wabowden Cree community. There's the Pa settlement, municipality, but there's also a bordering Métis or non-status community where a lot of the status people who became non-status went to live. So it was like just on land. So they end up, I think the Métis probably claimed that those folks there when they were developing the Métis Federation, because I remember way back then, my parents being non-status at the Métis Federation, the political body come and approach them and ask them to sign up as being Métis, which they did, you know, but as soon as the Indian Act changed in 1985, well, they were one of the first people to get reinstated as status people. So yeah, that's a long roundabout story, but that's where a lot of Métis communities kind of developed, is because they were ousted, pushed aside from the First Nation communities, and they were not welcome in the settler communities that were developing into municipalities. I hope that helps, Margaret. I see Christine. I can come back to you, but Christine had her hand up.
Also, can you just talk a little bit about what we could do? How can we move this history, like our own histories and your histories, how can we move that forward to our students, our communities, whatever, wherever we might be?
Talk about it. I'd say, you know, develop PowerPoints, talk about it, write about it, and keep storying about it, like Thomas King says. Somebody's going to learn something. Somebody will pick up something. Not everybody's going to. And just don't, you know, persevere in that. Just don't give up. I know there's a lot of things that, and I always tell people, look for facts and figures, those are only facts and figures. So like the year that, you know, August 28th, 1921, my grandfather from Germany, actually wasn't from Germany, but he was from Russia, German Russian. And my grandmother from Wabowden Cree Nation got married on that date. Okay, that's just a fact. But what are the stories all around that, stories leading up to that? Even how they met. Right? I mean, here there's 10-year difference between my grandmother and my grandfather. So, and then when my grandmother remarried, her second husband was from Scotland. He was a lovely, lovely man who was very good to her. He was like 28 years difference from her, with her. And then they had 5 children together. So, you know, aside from putting judgments aside, his daughter, my aunt, always kids around, yeah, my dad was a dirty old man. She said, marrying a young woman, you know, those are the kidding aside about the family and the relationships and stuff like that. So, you know, we use a lot of humor in our family to talk about some of our people and what they did. Yeah. But, you know, it's like, how do you not judge people? Because we don't know what their story is, right? And my poor grandmother, she was like, I don't think she was even past 5 feet tall, and I'm this towering, tall woman. When I asked her one day, when I asked her that question, I said, because the reason I asked her that question is I was going to high school in Cranberry Portage at the Frontier School Division. There was a residential school there. It was not the Indian residential schools, but it was still a residential school. And I used to go visit her on weekends in the Paw. And then I had a date one day with this RCMP young guy, white guy. And I knew that she hated whites in that way. She had this passion, she had a mistrust. So I told him, I said, don't come and pick me up, because we were supposed to go to a banquet. I said, don't come and pick me up until after she goes to the bingo, okay? So anyway, he come to pick me up, but he left his gloves, his gauntlets that somebody had made for him, and the word RCMP is written on there in the letters. I said, oh my goodness. When I got home, I made sure I tried to get home before she did, but she got home before me. And here's this little woman scolding this tall young teenager in Cree, and, you know, going down about this white man and this and that. And then finally I said to her, I said, Kukum. Kukum is grandmother in Cree. I said, Kukum, I don't understand you. I said, why do you hate white people so much? I said, you married 2 of them. And she said, well, those were my husbands. And then she started telling me her stories about how people treated her when she went downtown. But she didn't know the political fate or the political imposition of the Indian Act. Like, she didn't know about that. So here she's carrying this hatred, but we had a conversation about it and I had a better understanding of her. I said, oh, now I understand. And now I even have more understanding of her now that I know that she was taken away into residential school, because part of that going into residential school is taught you to hate your people. So in other words, maybe don't marry anybody from your own people because they're not suitable. So I'm thinking maybe some of this entered her being, who knows, right? But that's what, anyway, I'll stop on that one. So Christine, I apologize. I saw you had your hand up. Christine, did you have your hand up? Okay, no, yeah, no, okay. Anyone else?
How eager are your people to tell their stories to family members, younger family members?
Well, if there's safety there, the eagerness is there. If there's a felt safety there, the eagerness comes. So I don't think people are just kind of go out there and start telling stories. There's a lot of storytellers. We have a lot of storytellers. It's just a matter of finding ways to invite them into different spaces where their stories could be heard. I mean, I've certainly been witness to many different stories, and even in our own family, we don't think about, you know, what kind of story should we tell? Like I see my sister Lorna is on the phone there, But a lot of times we have these conversations and discussions, and she might say, oh, I didn't even know about that. I didn't know about that. Well, part of it is like, you know, who knows what ought to be said when, right? It's always a dialogue. It's always unfolding. And I think when opportunities present themselves for things to happen, that's when they happen.
Mhm. Yes, because I'm coming from Soviet time, from Soviet Estonia. And those were the times when many people were afraid to tell their stories because of the political reasons. They are afraid of this official Soviet rule. And that's why my generation very often didn't hear those stories. So I wonder if this, like this political system prevented your youth to hear those stories, or is it just like a personal decision, I'm going to talk or tell or not?
Well, I think it's both. You know, in spite of what's happening, I'm going to tell that story. But, you know, when I think about, you know, again, what stories do we tell? My eldest sister recently, well, it wasn't that recent, a few years ago, told us a story about our father. Because we were raised in northern Manitoba. We had a 38 acres right by a lake. But so when we were not living right in the community, but we were kind of aside from the community. And apparently there was some officials that came looking for kids that they could take to residential schools. So apparently when we were at that age, they came to our land. And then my dad had heard, he knew already about residential schools. He already knew about the trauma because his own mother went, my grandmother, my kugum. And he got, of course, you know, you heard a story about not being able to finish, not even grade 2, because of the day school, which is part of the residential school. And that he didn't have a status number, so they couldn't legally educate him in that way or school him. So he apparently these men, and I don't know if there was any women there, but officials came and they were asking about the kids. So my dad went and got his gun that he had from World War II and just point blank told them, "You're not taking my kids." So I just had no hesitation shooting people in the war. He said, "I'm not gonna have any hesitation shooting you. I fought for my country and I fought for my rights." So he said, "You're not taking my kids." Now my sister has that story. I don't. I'm a listener of that story and I have no reason to not believe her. That happened a lot to a lot of communities where they were literally going in and stealing kids to force them into the residential school prisons. They were not places to be willingly. Yeah.
If I can interject, just what you said about the Soviet times. Those of us, I'm a child of refugees, and of course my grandparents either couldn't come here, my parents came here, so I also missed a lot of those old stories. And the grandparents who lived in Estonia during the Soviet Union were unable to write letters to us to let us know. That's how we communicated then. So we didn't hear the stories either. But I wanted to say just one thing, Laara. I have an Estonian friend whose name is the same as your name, Laara. She's from Argentina, so it is also a name in Estonian. And the other thing that I liked was your word survivance.
Yeah.
And I was trying to think of the Estonian equivalent for that, and I think it just came to me. Is it vastupanu?
Yeah, probably, yeah.
Not giving up, remembering who we are. Is that that's vastupanu? So there is a word in Estonian for that. And Laara, I understand that you created this word survivance.
No.
Oh,
I mentioned I got it from Gerald Visner.
Oh, okay. I didn't hear.
Shabby literary giant, and he's from the States. You can look at his work, Visner, and I mean, he kind of, you know, he coins the word. He talks about it, the concept, but it's a concept that a lot of our people talked about it. Some of us talk about it from blood memory. You know, I know there's a friend one of my friend's daughter is actually doing her PhD on the notion of blood memory. Remember, you know, and then because a lot of that also suddenly emerges when we go back into our ceremonies and our traditions and ceremonies. Why is it suddenly we know things or we're connected? And it's like we didn't know before, but it's there. The spiritual connection and that through the visions and the dreams.
So some similarities I sort of picked on up today. Thank you very much.
Yeah, welcome.
Yeah, now researchers say that actually our genes are carrying our memory. So it's not just our brains or our head, but it comes with, the trauma goes from one generation to the next through the genes. So genes are actually carrying our memory.
Yeah. Yeah, there's starting to be a lot more writing on that. And I think there's one, if I'm saying is right, Gabor Mate. Gabor Mate has been doing a lot of work on that and a lot of presentations. And he's one of the favorites in Winnipeg, so they keep inviting him back. And I still haven't gone to listen to him, but I've looked at some of his work. So it's similar. And a lot of our Indigenous scholars do talk about that quite naturally in our ancestral knowledge that surfaces at different times. And we have people who are going into ceremonies, so, you know, our drum songs, our traditional songs, where they hadn't learned them, all of a sudden they're dreaming them and suddenly they're singing them. So where's that coming from? Whoops, sorry, that's my alarm is telling me to stop talking. Okay. Yeah, but there's lots, I think there's a lot written on that, you know, that notion of survivance, blood memory, you know. Yeah, it's in our DNA.
You have been like on the field of education for a long time. How do you see this dynamic in the Canadian school system? Like how much kids learn about your people here? Because I am not from here. I haven't gone to any schools here, but I'm talking to my Australian friends, and my understanding is that in curriculum, there is not much about your peoples, about their stories, their experiences. But what is the dynamics if you look back from today into the past?
Well, what are the dynamics? What I would say, there's definitely a need for that to happen. You know, part of my experience in working with my own colleagues over the time that I've been at the universities and that is always a lot of resistance from my colleagues. Just resistance of bringing in Aboriginal literatures, content, experiences, elders, anything. So now that's more readily available and the willingness is there. And there's a lot of people writing on the how-to part, what to bring in. And I say, well, you know, why Aboriginal education? Well, we're part of Canadian society. We're part of Canadian history. We're predate Canadian history. So we're part of the body of people that people need to know about. And then when you think about it, a lot of the laws that were developed, especially the laws that are very around human rights and kindness and that, are based on our Indigenous knowledges, you know, the caucus. So people need to know that. And then there's so many people that are now writing about it and how to do it in the classroom. Even like the idea of doing land acknowledgement, that every school can do that. They can develop their own, you know, of course they can see what other people have done, but do that as a study, as immersion, bring in Indigenous scholars to do that. And that's, that puts us forward towards reconciliation. Like the Truth and Reconciliation report has a lot of ideas there There's what 94, I believe 94 recommendations on every aspect of life. So if people took that as part of their retreats, or when they have education to make that happen, well, it can happen. So I think that every groups that are developing, like the Estonia groups, and there's so many enclave of European groups that are in Canada, they can take that as part of their policy, of their visions, their mission statements. Write that in. The more you do that, the more it becomes apparent that coming in, they'll start asking questions. Oh, what's that all about? How can I do that? Yeah.
We tried, at least. We began with this process, and when I think about the future museum, because Estonians already know that we want to build a new building for our museum here in Toronto. So in this new building with a new permanent exhibit, we definitely want to start building that kind of bridges, because we as a small nation, we understand that, we totally understand the need that other people acknowledge you.
Yeah.
Who you, a person who you are, with all your experiences, with your maybe different culture, strange language, strange names. Estonians in Canada keep struggling with their strange names. There are lots of funny stories how people keep explaining, you know, what my name really is. And all those little struggles, it should help us to understand other people. And I think for small nations, it's much, much easier to do than for bigger nations.
Mm-hmm. You know, when I think about the impact of colonialism, it's like, you know, like how many people know that we have over 700 language dialects or Indigenous in Canada under about 12 language groups. Okay, there's, and that's a lot. We have over 600 and, might have the, anyway, over 620 First Nation communities across Canada. We're everywhere. It's like we're small little communities, but we're everywhere. We're not just also related in our communities, we're in cities, we're in rural communities, you know, we're everywhere. So that this education should not be a complication. It should be just a part of what we need to do as a Canadian citizen, is to honor, you know, the First Peoples, the primacy of the First Peoples of this land, you know.
If there are no other questions, then as I said in the very beginning, I don't think that should be the first and the last talk with Laara, because we can see there are so many interesting topics and stories to share and things to discuss. So I really hope that we can get maybe some more lectures, or like the talks from you or your colleagues. Everyone is very welcome to join our lecture series at Vemu. And if there are no any questions, maybe the last comment from Laara for tonight before we say
good night. Well, you know, the way I see it and the way I like to, the approach I like is to, this is a dialogue. If we could move away from like comparing, this is better than, that, you know, recognizing that there are so many different stories that people have, and within the Canadian context is to acknowledge without apology the primacy of Indigenous peoples, without feeling threatened by it, you know, that it should be a dialogue. And then what other experiences do different groups have that can bring that dialogue forward of sharing stories, telling stories? Where can we work together? How can we move forward in that way, in a good, kind, collaborative, collective, individual, caring way? You know, and that's, yeah. So maybe I'm, I'm out of thought. So maybe I just want to say thank you to each and every one of you that have tuned in. This is kind of a new experience on Zoom to do it. You know, where do you go with anything that we're doing? But it's, you know, that's part of life now, right? It's part of our being. And I think there's a lot of goodness there. And I really appreciate it. Yeah. So thank you again, Eric, for inviting me. And I was a bit hesitant at first. I said, what can I contribute to this little group here? But, you know, it is what it is. And, you know, we go forward with what we've heard and to do it well. Thank
Laara, you are
my
most
sister,
welcome.
Lorna.
Yeah. Laara and your friends, you are most welcome to Tartu College to visit our little museum there. So as promised, I'd like to give you a tour and tell more about what the Estonian community has been done to keep their history alive and stories told to the younger generation. So you really are very, very welcome to Tartu College. And I think I would reach out to Laara to find out what's the best time for that and how to arrange that. So, hi, if that's what your people say.
Okay. Okay, bye everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
good
you.
night.
Thank you so much.
Bye.